Inside Windsor Castle, certain moments never arrive with public announcement or visible ceremony, yet they reshape how history is perceived within its walls. What recently unfolded is being discussed in exactly that way, not as a sudden spectacle, but as a quiet institutional decision that carries emotional weight because of who it involves and what it represents. At the center of this conversation is a portrait of Princess Diana, a figure whose legacy continues to hold a powerful and deeply emotional place in both public memory and royal history. The painting itself originates from a period when Diana stood at the height of global admiration. At that time, she was not only a member of the royal family, but also a cultural presence whose influence extended far beyond formal titles and ceremonial duties. Artists who worked with her during that era often described her presence as unusually expressive, someone who could shift the tone of a room without effort. That quality translated into portraiture in a distinctive way. The finished artwork was not just a formal representation of royalty. It reflected warmth, openness, and a sense of emotional accessibility that defined how the public connected with her. Those who saw the portrait in its early years often remarked that it felt different from traditional royal imagery. Instead of emphasizing distance or formality, it appeared to highlight personality. It captured a moment in time when Diana's public image was evolving into something more modern, more relatable, and more emotionally resonant than previous generations of royal representation. Because of this, the painting was widely expected to become part of Windsor Castle's formal visual archive, particularly within spaces dedicated to the monarchy's most influential women. Within the structure of Windsor Castle, there are designated galleries that serve as curated historical records rather than decorative spaces. These rooms function as visual timelines of the monarchy, where each portrait contributes to a broader narrative of continuity and legacy. The Hall of Matriarchs, in particular, is regarded as one of the most symbolically significant spaces within the palace. It is reserved for women whose roles have shaped the monarchy across different eras, whether through long reigns, public service, or cultural influence. Placement within this space is not casual. It is carefully considered, reflecting both historical importance and institutional perspective. At one stage, it was widely assumed that Diana's portrait would eventually be installed there. Her influence on modern royal history was undeniable, and her global recognition placed her among the most discussed figures associated with the monarchy in the last century. However, the transition from expectation to reality did not follow a direct or publicly explained path. As the royal household moved through the aftermath of her passing and into a period of institutional restructuring, many decisions regarding displays, archives, and ceremonial presentation were made quietly and within internal frameworks that are not typically disclosed to the public. Over time, the portrait did not appear in the expected ceremonial setting. Instead, it became part of the palace's extensive internal collection, stored safely within archival systems designed to preserve historical artifacts. In large institutions like the royal household, storage does not imply neglect. It reflects a broader curatorial process where objects are preserved until they are reassessed for display suitability, condition, or thematic alignment with evolving exhibitions. This is how the painting remained out of public view for years, gradually becoming part of a larger conversation about how royal history is visually represented. Diana's presence in public memory only grew stronger over time, reinforced by documentaries, public reflection, and generational storytelling. Yet inside official spaces, her representation remained more restrained and structured, shaped by institutional considerations rather than public sentiment. The contrast between public memory and institutional display has always been a defining feature of modern monarchy. Some figures exist simultaneously in both realms, but are not always represented equally within them. Diana is one of the most prominent examples of this dynamic. Her image continues to evoke strong emotional response globally, while her formal representation within royal spaces has historically followed a more measured and carefully controlled path. In recent years, however, there has been increasing attention on how historical figures are represented within royal residences. As curatorial practices evolve, institutions often revisit earlier decisions to ensure that their visual archives reflect both historical accuracy and contemporary understanding. This process is gradual and typically occurs without public announcement, as it is part of ongoing preservation and reevaluation work rather than a single defining event. It is within this broader context that the portrait's return to prominence is being discussed, not as an isolated moment of drama, but as part of an ongoing process through which institutions continuously refine how they present their own history. The movement of artwork within royal spaces is not uncommon, and it often reflects changes in conservation needs, thematic organization, or interpretive direction. However, when the subject is as globally significant as Diana, even routine curatorial decisions naturally attract heightened attention. What makes this situation particularly notable is not only the artwork itself, but the symbolic meaning attached to its placement within Windsor Castle's historical framework. When a figure is visually reintroduced into a space dedicated to legacy and memory, it inevitably prompts reflection on how that figure is understood within both public and institutional narratives. In this sense, the portrait becomes more than an object. It becomes part of a larger conversation about how history is arranged, how memory is preserved, and how institutions balance tradition with evolving perspectives. And within the walls of Windsor Castle, where centuries of royal history are carefully maintained, even quiet decisions can carry a significance that extends far beyond the rooms in which they occur. After Princess Diana's passing in 1997, the British monarchy entered a period defined by both emotional shock and institutional pressure. Public reaction was immediate and unprecedented in scale, with mourning expressed not only across the United Kingdom, but around the world. Within the royal household, however, the situation unfolded in a far more controlled and structured environment. The institution was required to maintain continuity while simultaneously responding to a moment of national grief, creating a complex balance between private emotion and public responsibility. During this period, the royal family operated under intense scrutiny. Every gesture, appearance, and decision was interpreted through the lens of public expectation. Internally, this meant that the household had to move carefully, ensuring that stability was preserved while also addressing the sensitivities surrounding Diana's legacy. In such circumstances, institutions often make adjustments that are not publicly detailed, particularly when they relate to the organization of residences, archives, and ceremonial spaces. As the years progressed, royal residences naturally underwent changes consistent with evolving roles, administrations, and curatorial practices. These changes included the reorganization of personal and ceremonial spaces, as well as the relocation of various items connected to different periods of royal history. Within this broader process, visual representations associated with previous eras were sometimes moved into storage or less prominent areas. This is a standard practice in large historical institutions, where preservation, rotation, and contextual display all play a role in how objects are managed over time. Within this environment, Diana's portrait gradually shifted away from expected public or ceremonial display. Rather than being presented in prominent gallery spaces, it became part of the internal archival collection. This transition was not framed publicly as a statement or decision, but rather as part of ongoing institutional management. Over time, however, the absence of her image from visible royal spaces became more noticeable to observers, especially given her continued prominence in public memory. For years following these changes, the situation remained largely unaddressed in public discourse. The monarchy continued its formal duties, maintaining tradition and adapting to new responsibilities under changing leadership and generational transition. Meanwhile, Diana's legacy continued to grow outside institutional settings. Through media, documentaries, charitable work connected to her name, and public remembrance, she remained one of the most emotionally resonant figures in modern royal history. This created a clear contrast between two parallel narratives. On one side, there was the institutional perspective, where representation is shaped by protocol, curation, and historical structure. On the other, there was public memory, where Diana's image remained vivid, influential, and deeply personal for millions of people. The difference between these two perspectives gradually became more visible over time, not through direct confrontation, but through absence and presence in different spaces. Inside royal residences, visual representation is not static. Portraits, Artworks and historical artifacts are periodically reviewed and repositioned based on conservation needs, thematic relevance, and curatorial direction. This means that what is displayed in one era may not remain in the same position in the next. However, when a figure holds significant cultural and emotional weight, even routine curatorial decisions can gain symbolic interpretation beyond their administrative intent. Diana's absence from prominent display areas therefore became part of a broader conversation about how institutions manage memory. It was not framed officially as exclusion or omission, but rather observed externally as a gap between public sentiment and institutional presentation. This distinction is important because it highlights how large historical institutions often operate on timelines and frameworks that differ from public emotional cycles. As time passed, the monarchy itself evolved. New generations assumed more active roles, and the institution continued to modernize aspects of its public engagement. Within this gradual evolution, there was also increasing reflection on how historical figures are represented within official spaces. This reflection is typically subtle and incremental, involving curatorial reassessment rather than abrupt change. Against this backdrop, any reconsideration of Diana's representation within royal residences naturally carries added significance. Not because of a single event or decision, but because of the long-standing difference between how she is remembered publicly and how she has been historically displayed within institutional environments. Ultimately, the years following 1997 shaped a dual legacy, one maintained within structured institutional frameworks, and another sustained through public memory and cultural recognition. The contrast between these two forms of remembrance became one of the defining characteristics of how Diana's place within modern royal history is understood. As the next generation of the royal family matured, the relationship between personal memory and institutional responsibility became increasingly layered. What had once been historical narrative gradually became lived experience for those directly connected to it. William, in particular, grew up carrying a public role shaped by early personal loss, and that experience inevitably influenced how he understood both duty and legacy within the monarchy. From a young age, he was placed in a position where private grief and public expectation existed side by side. While his official appearances reflected composure and continuity, the personal dimension of his history remained a defining part of his identity. As he moved into adulthood and gradually assumed more responsibility within the institution, the awareness of how his mother was remembered both publicly and within formal royal spaces became part of a broader reflection on legacy, rather than a single point of focus. Within royal institutions, questions of historical recognition are rarely straightforward. The monarchy operates through long-established frameworks built on tradition, precedent, and careful protocol. Decisions about what is displayed, how it is displayed, and where it is placed are not simply aesthetic choices. They are shaped by layers of historical context, institutional sensitivity, and curatorial structure. Because of this, even discussions about representation tend to develop slowly, often over extended periods rather than through immediate action. At the same time, institutions are not static. As generations change, so too do perspectives on how history should be visually and symbolically presented. New members of the royal family bring with them different experiences and interpretations of legacy, which naturally contribute to evolving conversations about representation. These conversations are typically quiet and internal, unfolding through gradual reassessment rather than public statements or abrupt decisions. Over time, this slow evolution created space for reconsideration, not in the sense of breaking from tradition, but in the sense of re-examining how tradition itself is expressed within modern contexts. Questions about what belongs in prominent ceremonial spaces, how historical figures are positioned in relation to one another, and how different eras of the monarchy are visually connected began to take on renewed relevance. In this environment, the idea of revisiting earlier curatorial choices becomes part of a broader institutional process. Royal residences like Windsor Castle are not static museums. They are living environments where historical display is continuously maintained, reviewed, and adjusted. Artworks, portraits, and artifacts are periodically reassessed to ensure they align with conservation standards, thematic coherence, and evolving interpretive approaches. This ongoing process naturally opens the door for reflection on past decisions, including what has been prominently displayed and what has remained out of view. Such reflection is not necessarily driven by a single individual or moment, but rather by the gradual accumulation of institutional perspective over time. As roles within the family shift and new responsibilities emerge, these considerations become part of a wider conversation about how the monarchy presents its own history to itself and to the public. In that sense, the question of representation is not only about presence, but also about placement within a larger narrative structure. Where a figure is positioned within a historical gallery influences how they are perceived in relation to others, and how their legacy is visually integrated into the broader story of the institution. These are decisions that carry symbolic meaning, even when they are made through standard curatorial processes. As reflection continues within this framework, the focus remains on balancing continuity with reinterpretation. The monarchy's strength has long been rooted in its ability to preserve tradition while adapting to changing times, and visual representation within royal residences is one of the ways this balance is expressed. Over time, this gradual process of reassessment shapes how history is organized within its walls, ensuring that legacy is not only preserved, but continuously recontextualized within an evolving institutional landscape. Eventually, within the established structures of Windsor Castle, a curatorial decision was carried out that brought Princess Diana's portrait back into a more prominent historical setting. Like many actions taken inside royal residences, the process was not framed as a public event or symbolic announcement, but as part of ongoing internal management of historical display. Within institutions of this scale, changes to artwork placement typically follow formal procedures involving conservation checks, curatorial review, and approval through internal channels designed to maintain consistency with tradition and protocol. The portrait itself was handled according to standard preservation practices. Before any installation, works of art that have been in long-term storage undergo careful assessment to ensure their condition is suitable for display. This includes restoration review, framing adjustments if necessary, and environmental preparation to ensure proper lighting and protection within the gallery space. Once these steps are completed, the artwork is integrated into its designated location in a way that aligns with the overall composition of the room. In this case, the painting was placed within a section of Windsor Castle dedicated to historically significant women associated with the monarchy. This type of gallery is designed to present a visual narrative of continuity across generations, where each figure contributes to a broader historical timeline. The positioning of portraits within such spaces is carefully considered, not only in terms of individual significance, but also in relation to surrounding figures, ensuring a balanced representation of different eras and roles within royal history. Diana's placement within this environment naturally creates a visual connection with Queen Elizabeth II, a figure whose long reign defined stability and institutional continuity across the modern era. While the two lived very different public roles, their presence within the same historical space reflects how the monarchy organizes its visual heritage, through relationships between figures who each shape the institution in distinct but meaningful ways. In curatorial terms, such placement is about constructing historical dialogue within the space, allowing visitors to interpret the evolution of the monarchy through visual association. The installation process itself was carried out with minimal disruption to the surrounding environment. As is common in such settings, work is typically scheduled during controlled hours to ensure both security and preservation standards are maintained. Once the portrait was secured in place, the room returned to its usual state of quiet formality, consistent with the rest of Windsor Castle's ceremonial spaces. Those familiar with the process of royal curation often describe these moments not as dramatic shifts, but as subtle adjustments within a long-standing system of historical presentation. The monarchy's visual archives are continuously maintained, meaning that even significant placements are part of an ongoing cycle of review and refinement rather than isolated events. In this context, the reintroduction of a portrait is less about sudden change and more about completing a long-term curatorial intention. There was no accompanying public ceremony or formal announcement attached to the installation. This approach is consistent with how many internal adjustments within royal residences are handled, particularly when they relate to historical display rather than official state events. The emphasis remains on preserving institutional continuity and ensuring that changes are integrated smoothly into the existing structure without disrupting the function of the residents. For those within the institution, the moment represented a quiet completion of a curatorial process that had developed over time. It reflected an approach to heritage management that prioritizes measured action over public signaling, ensuring that historical representation within royal spaces remains aligned with both tradition and evolving perspectives. Within the broader narrative of Windsor Castle, such adjustments contribute to an ongoing effort to maintain the integrity of its historical galleries. Each addition or repositioning becomes part of a larger framework through which the monarchy's visual history is organized, preserved, and interpreted. In this way, even subtle changes carry meaning, not through spectacle, but through their place within the continuous evolution of institutional memory. In the days that followed, attention naturally extended beyond the walls of Windsor Castle. Whenever something associated with royal residences shifts, even quietly, it tends to generate discussion in public spaces, media analysis, and commentary circles. This is not unusual, as the monarchy exists in a unique position where internal decisions are often interpreted externally through historical memory, cultural meaning, and long-standing public narratives. Reactions varied significantly. Some viewed the adjustment as part of a broader effort to bring historical representation closer in line with public sentiment, especially regarding figures who remain deeply embedded in collective memory. From this perspective, the placement of Diana's portrait in a more prominent setting was interpreted as a form of recognition that aligns institutional presentation with how she is remembered globally. Others approached it more cautiously, framing it within the broader context of how royal history is curated over time. In this view, changes within Windsor Castle are not isolated statements, but part of a continuous process of managing heritage. The monarchy has always balanced tradition with adaptation, and visual representation within its residences reflects that ongoing equilibrium rather than single defining moments. Inside the royal household itself, however, the interpretation is far more structured and procedural. Changes to displays, portraits, and historical arrangements are typically understood as part of curatorial responsibility rather than symbolic declarations. The focus remains on preservation, accuracy, and the consistent maintenance of historical spaces that represent centuries of continuity. From this internal perspective, what appears externally as a significant moment is often simply one step within a longer process of refinement and organization. This difference in perspective between internal function and external interpretation is one of the defining features of how royal institutions operate in the modern era. The monarchy does not communicate every adjustment publicly, nor does it frame curatorial decisions as narrative events. Instead, it maintains a steady rhythm of internal management while allowing public understanding to develop independently through observation, discussion, and interpretation. Over time, however, certain figures naturally carry more interpretive weight than others. Diana remains one of the most emotionally resonant individuals associated with the modern royal family, and because of that, any change involving her representation inevitably carries broader symbolic associations. Even when actions are administrative in nature, they are often received through a lens shaped by decades of public memory and cultural significance. In this case, the portrait's renewed visibility becomes less about a singular institutional decision and more about how legacy evolves within structured historical environments. The monarchy, like any long-standing institution, continuously redefines how its past is organized and presented. This includes reassessing how individuals are visually positioned within its narrative spaces, ensuring that representation remains coherent with both historical context and evolving curatorial understanding. What stands out most in this entire process is not disruption, but continuity. Windsor Castle remains what it has always been, a living institution where history is not frozen, but carefully maintained and periodically recontextualized. Changes do not break tradition, they operate within it. And in that sense, even subtle adjustments contribute to the broader story of how the monarchy preserves its identity across generations. In the end, the return of the portrait to prominence is best understood as part of this ongoing evolution. It reflects how institutions handle memory, how they organize legacy, and how they balance permanence with reinterpretation. It is not a conclusion, but a continuation of a much longer historical narrative, one that is still being written within the same walls where centuries of royal history continue to unfold. And as viewers, observers, and storytellers, we are left with a reminder. History is not only what is remembered, but also how it is displayed, revisited, and reframed over time. If you found this breakdown insightful, consider subscribing for more deep dive storytelling into royal history, untold narratives, and behind-the-scenes institutional changes. And let us know in the comments, do you think history is being rewritten or finally being properly recognized?